you for making space for me. We are going to step through. I do want to kind of give a precursor as we look at kind of asset stewardship and sustainability. It's going to be very broad-based, so I want to offer a few things to you. So we're going to start with a theological framework, a very brief theological framework. Then we're going to work through the three things that Brother Bruce gave to me: the soul sets, the skill sets, and the tool sets. Such a preacher. That will address these things. Okay, so again, we won't be able to go in depth, but I'm hoping to give you a few core things that maybe you can grip and use within your context. Take what you need. If you don't need it, just say, "Oh, I don't need that." Leave it on the table. All right. And we will leave some time at the end as per the space to have some questions if there are questions. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So we are going to get started with a brief theological overview or framework. And the reason I feel like this is important, because when we start to talk about all of the things that come with what we have held on to or how we have shifted in the midst of COVID, I think it's important before we start talking about change, which is already upon us, which we're already in, to talk about why change is so hard and to consider what we need to be looking at and be mindful of in our own processes and in the process of leadership within the church to consider, so that we aren't missing some of the core things that need to happen so that we are prepared for change. All right, so I want to give us kind of two basic theological considerations. The first is from Exodus 16:2. This may be a familiar passage for many of you. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." So what we are seeing here, I've often heard this passage preached over the years from the perspective of having an enslaved mentality, right? But I would like to press us even beyond that in this moment. So when we look at what is called in psychology systems theory, it's this concept and this understanding that any system, whether it's the system of the self, whether it is a system that's a family, whether it is a system that is an ecosystem that's a community or a church, a school, academia, any system of people performs in such a way that when that system is disrupted, when the norm of that system is disrupted, that something in that system wants to change it back to the norm. Okay, so even if the change is for the good, right? So even if we're changing something in the system that's going to make the system better, there is someone or something in that system that's going to want to regulate it back to the norm. One of the ways this happens, for example, physiologically in our bodies is, our sweat component. If our body overheats, to bring it back to its normal temperature, we sweat. Let's get it back, right? So this is important to remember, that this is what is showing up here. Okay, that these are people who have been subjected to enslavement, to levels of dehumanization. And the one thing that they had in enslavement that was a sense of security for them was food, right? So what we see here is that out of all the ways they were mistreated, they fed them. And when you have been denied many, many things, but you have one place of security, if you got one thing that's secure when everything else is shaky, and that one thing is taken, even if everything else is given to you, you got to deal with the one thing that you have depended upon all that time, right? You've got to attend to that thing. And so one of the things I want us to remember when we start to talk about asset stewardship and sustainability, we're talking about security, y'all. And security has deeply rooted emotional and mental things that we need to be attentive to. Okay, our sense of security can make us do a lot of things. All right. So what we see happening here is that they needed to grieve. They needed to grieve what they perceived was a loss in order to move forward. Okay. And so there are things that happened before the pandemic, ways that happened before the pandemic, and we've been talking a lot about the grief, but where else might this be showing up? So grief here, again, is deep and poignant distress caused by bereavement or loss, any kind of loss. All right. And so the children of Israel were free and they were coming into freedom, but they needed to grieve what one good thing they thought they had in order to actually move into a new direction. Okay. So one of the things we need to always be holding as we are looking to strive, either in the midst of this, or if we'll ever be on the other side of this, is that grief is a continuous cycle and it comes up more often than we may think. All right. One of the greatest things that we overlook when it comes to change is grief. Change always brings grief because we're losing something, even if it's just a norm. Second consideration, Deuteronomy 30:19. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live. So if we fast forward, y'all, children of Israel been out in the wilderness, right? Trudging along, making their way. And finally, they've now changed leadership. They've gone from Moses to Joshua. They're ready to go into the promised land, right? But here we see God is talking to them. And this first line is pivotal. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses. Y'all, God needed a witness. Consider what that means. God of creation needed a witness with God's people. Loss, pain, right? Struggle always impacts our trust. Always impacts our trust to the extent that God needed a witness that what God said was true. This is the second theological consideration I want you to hold close when you're talking about change, either for yourself or leading others in change, particularly within the church. Most of us have lived long enough to realize that we are always on a trust continuum. Always, I don't care who we are. We're always in a space of learning to trust more, to trust God more, okay? Change challenges trust, and trust demands that we recommit to faith, okay? So this is always about us bringing ourselves back to our core, right? Back. So I often tell people, you know, it's not that we didn't need God before. It's just that now we just a little bit more aware of it, right? We still need God. We needed God just as much before do now. That hasn't changed, okay? And what is faith, y'all? The substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. Unseen, key word here, okay? What I offer to you tonight, what others offer to you tonight is not prescriptive in that we can't give you a 10-point step that says, if you do this, you got it, right? We all get that. What we do offer, though, are the considerations of what is needed for reimagination. And when we start talking about reimagination, we are always talking about uncharted territory. We cannot move in uncharted territory, in the places we have not seen, without faith. All right? So attend to grief, come back to your faith, because these kinds of times in our lives shakes our trust in ways sometimes that we're not aware. Uncharted territory makes us nervous when we start talking about security, okay? And so to remind ourselves and to remind our people, provision is always God's territory, all right? Sometimes we hold as leaders the mantle and the burden, particularly in organizations and in institutions like the church, which are mostly volunteer-based and dependent upon what people give. We hold the mantle and the heaviness of that. But I would encourage you to lean into the reality that our God provides before you even start doing this work. All right, so soul sets. Now, when I say soul, notice I said I. When I say soul, I mean the mind, the will, and the emotions. Okay, so if you had the opportunity to see the sermon that was a part of the service link that Reverend Liz sent out, self-compassion. I want to just give a definition of self-compassion. Empathetic consciousness of one's own distress together with a desire to alleviate it. Okay. So grace for self means not holding more than what's yours while being accountable for what is. Okay. Don't let your standards be higher than God's. If God extends grace to us, then far be it from us to say that we can't extend grace to ourselves. All right. So a part of the soul work as we start to move into these conversations about security and sustainability and assets is understanding that our own and our people's souls, we need to be teaching and be steeped in this sense of self-compassion. Okay, extending to ourselves what God extends to us. Francis Chan, pastor out in San Francisco, once said, "Don't let the work we do for God destroy the work God is doing in us." Okay. And the third thing I'll say is don't be an island. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to tool sets, but build and embrace community. All right. So another area of soul sets. I wanted to give you this. There are many change cycles that we use in psychology and sociology. This is one that I like, but you can go out there and find many. This is by the interchange cycle. And I wanted you to have this. I will provide these slides as Liz has asked for them. But I wanted you to have this because I wanted you to see that there is a cycle to change, okay, within ourselves, but also within our institutions, our organizations, and our churches, okay? And I particularly like this 6-stage change because it names some of the things that we've just kind of laid out. So stage 1 and 2, those are those stages of grief. You see the feelings there, fear. We're thoughts of being cautious, right? The behavior is kind of like we're paralyzed. So whether it's you or whether it is those you are leading, it is important to be mindful that when change begins to happen, these are the things that people are experiencing, right? This is what they are literally living into. Stage 2, doubt. So you got loss, that's the start of that grief process. Then you got doubt, feelings of resentment, skeptical, you're resistant, okay? So if you're a pastor, for example, my question to you is, if you know that these are a part of the stages of this change cycle, because we need to be in this change cycle, how do you preach to this? How do you pastor to this, right? How do you shape, you know this change is already upon us, you know people are feeling this, how do we undergird people spiritually and theologically? How do we disciple them to be prepared to walk through this cycle, okay? So stages 1 and 2, those really early, harder stages of grief. Then you get into stages 3 and 4, right? So stage 3, this discomfort. This is kind of like your awakening. Like you could be denying, people could be denying, no, we don't have to change. You know, no, we don't. We really gonna have to come back and wear masks? You know, are we really gonna have to, you know, spread out? Like, are we really gonna have to wait a little longer? No, people, it finally settles in. If we're gonna do this, it's different, it's changed. And so now I have anxiety, I'm confused, and I'm unproductive because I don't know what to do, right? Like I know it's there, but I really don't wanna kind of still move into it. So there's this discomfort. And then right in the middle of stage 3 and stage 4 is a danger zone. And the reason this danger zone is here is because this is right here. This is about where you can start to get to a peace point with your grief process. You can either accept that the change is there, or you could swing back into denial. Okay, so that's a very pivotal moment. Again, I want you thinking, how are we discipling people? How are we being with people? How are we pastoring people in the midst of these different stages? How are we making them aware of what is happening and how this is, it's normal for them to feel this way. It's normal for us to feel this way, okay? We're moving to discovery. Now, if we are able to make it past that danger zone, we've accepted that this change is here. Now, all of a sudden, I've made a commitment that something else needs to be done. Okay. Now I can anticipate. Now, all of a sudden, I can start to imagine. Now I'm energized. And then we can move into stages 5 and 6 with confidence. I can be more pragmatic and productive. But this also means that if I'm holding this kind of sense of self-compassion and I'm helping my people hold this sense of grace and self-compassion, that it also means that we're walking in faith, right? So this confidence isn't necessarily in where we know we're going. Uncharted territory, we never really know where we're going. It's about faith. So my confidence is that, A, we're going to try a few things, might not work out. That's all right. But we haven't wasted our time, because now we know that doesn't work. We can go to something else. Okay. And then this integration, right? Now, whatever this change is, it's a part of our life. It's a way of life. It's something we have to consider. We're going to continue to consider it. And now I'm focused. And now I have a lot more generosity, a lot more space, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, right? To make room for other things. All right. So if we had more time, we could spend time here. You can see this excites me, but we're going to keep going. So skill sets. What has changed? Everything and nothing. Everything and nothing. The work of pastor and ministry leadership remains the same, you all. Even if the methods change and evolve, okay? This is our anchor. And I cannot emphasize this enough, you all. We must have our anchor in place. We must realize that just because the landscape has changed, just because we're in a space that is unknown and that is highly stressful, it doesn't change the fact that who we are, how we've been called, our gifting, our training, our anointing goes out the door. No, that becomes our anchor. Because how we love, minister, and relate to one another doesn't change, even if the methods do. All right? So focus in seasons of doubt and uncertainty. When in doubt, even as you're going through your own process, you're like, I don't even have the energy to wrap my mind around what we need to do. I'm going to keep mulling over it. Continue to use your gifts to prepare your people spiritually and theologically for change, even if you're not sure what that change is going to be. Okay? Use your anchor of who you are. Be relational. All right, so tool sets. So when we start to talk about vision versus mission, and I know one of the other speakers, I think, kind of started to touch on this. If we're going to start to talk about sustainability, if we're going to start to talk about assets, then we have to start to think about and rethink in the midst of change who we are. Okay, so I don't want to assume where people are or if we have the same understanding of this. So generally speaking, I understand vision to be the what. Vision statements are idealistic. They are, this is what we want to see as a result of us being here, right? So for example, if I am a literary nonprofit, a literacy nonprofit in Baltimore, my vision statement might read, I want all kids in Baltimore to know how to read. You see how lofty that is, how big that is, but it's not all over the place. It's not, I want them to be able to read and write novels. It is, I just want them to be able to read, but that's still big and lofty. It's idealistic. That's the vision that I have. It's how I want the world, my part of the world to look as a result of what we do. Okay. So the vision is the what. The mission is the how. Okay. So the mission may still be broader statements, but the mission is more, if I want all kids to read in Baltimore, we will do this through, community strategic partnerships, and many things can fall under community strategic partnerships. We will do this through collaborations with schools. There are many collaborations that can happen with schools. So you don't close yourself in, but you're still very clear about the ways or the modes in which you're going to actually do this so that you can still track whether or not this is happening. I would say simplify and clarify. Don't make it too much, don't make it too little. And I would invite us in times of change to always revisit this, you know? And so invite others to reimagine. Now I'm getting ready to go to the next slide, but I need to give another precursor before I go to the slide. All right, family, I can't see all your faces, but I'm gonna pretend like I can see your faces. All right, I'm gonna go to the next slide. The next slide is one of those things that I talked about at the beginning. It is one way that I've seen it happen. Okay, my hope is that what I am offering will ignite in you your own imagination, because you know your spaces better than anybody. Okay, and so I'm giving you an example of what I know and have seen to have worked, but you aren't bound by this, limited by this. I hope that it, more than anything, that it stokes a fire of reimagination as we lean into trusting God. You will see at the beginning of every slide, just like you see at the beginning of this one, pray and trust. I'm gonna say it over and over again, y'all. Pray and trust. See it right there? Pray and trust. See the number one? That's pray and trust. So one of the ways that I have seen this work well is a reimagination session, or a reimagining session, okay? Now, of course, with COVID, whether this is done Zoom, whether it's done when it's warmer weather and it's outside, or wherever we'll be, right? But whenever we're coming into a season where things have changed, as in a lot of the pastors that I coach and that I walk with spiritually have found that even if they are back in person, many of them aren't, even if they are back in person, volunteer base is just not there. Like folk are just not in the groove of coming back. And they're like, what do we do? Like, we depend fully on volunteers. Well, some of them are taking the opportunity to lean into, okay, well then, where are we? How do we discern and hear from God together, right? And so here's one opportunity. You can do a leader's lunch or an open reimagination session. If you do an open session, I would always encourage you, depending on the makeup of who you are doing this with. If it's in person, make sure the gathering can accommodate children, right? So that you have multiple voices, and invite or include across generations, okay? So that the whole church community is there. And it's designed to discern the immediate needs, or to discern the difference between immediate needs from the hopes and dreams, okay? So I would recommend doing personal invites, meaning if you are a ministry leader or a pastor, and particularly if you're going to do a leaders reimagination session, set up one-to-ones, do 30-minute one-to-ones with the people you're inviting, invite them personally. It's a lot harder for people to say no when you personally invite them, okay? Invite them personally. Here are a few questions that I've seen out there. These questions would change based upon where you are and what you need. Who have we been, right? As a church before this, who have we been? Is that still who we are? Is it who we should be? How does who we are differ from what we do? Okay. Who would our surrounding community say that we are? Right? Who do our neighbors say that we are? Do we even know that? And if not, why not? Is it time to find that out? And then, based upon the needs of our congregation and community, what do we sense God calling us to? Okay. What do we sense together? Now, if you're a pastor in the room, I'm hoping you're hearing that this is a little different, right? I grew up in the Black Baptist church in the South, which was, pastor hold a vision. I am suggesting that the church holds the vision. Doesn't mean that the pastor doesn't guide it. Doesn't mean that the pastor doesn't help cultivate it and shape it. But pastors, no matter what tradition you're in, come and go. How do you help all your people hold this thing, take ownership in it? You invite them to the table because it's who they are, right? We're all of this, okay? Based upon current resources, what is the best way for us to continue on this path? Now, the last one, or the next to the last one, is sometimes a very difficult one for folk. If resources were limitless, right, what would we do? Sometimes we leave that off. You know, we only do needs. And I'm suggesting that we don't need to just only do needs, particularly in a time where we feel like resources are scarce, in a time where we feel like we're strained. This is the time where we need to dream the most. Okay, there is a great reminder of this. If we go back to the children of Israel, I once heard Rabbi Miriam, rabbi out of Raleigh, came and spoke at an event, and she talked about the tradition within the Jewish culture where they talked about, they tell the stories in between the stories, right? That's what good preaching is, telling the story in between the story. And she said, one of the stories that is told in the Jewish tradition is about how Miriam and the women came out of enslavement and were in the wilderness with tambourines. And the question that they ask is, where did you get a tambourine from? Right? And she says, and where we land with that is that while enslaved, while in bondage, while in struggle, they were crafting and making the instruments of freedom. Y'all, this is the time to dream. We cannot get stuck just in struggle. We cannot get stuck just in the scarcity of what we don't have. You know why? Because the first thing on every slide is pray and trust. Okay? Our God of provision is abundant. Allow hope to come in. So allow your people space, like create space for people to imagine and dream together. How are we going to do this together? Let them be the writers of the story along with you. Let them pray with you, right? So that it's not just on the shoulders of a few, but all of us, okay? And then just strategically, what are the next steps? Okay, so what do we need to focus on first? So we've gathered all this stuff, right? We've pulled all these ideas, we focused on these things, and you know, what then are some of the next steps? And this is where, you know, them good old committees can come in place. So it might be that you gather a few people who were there, or a few people who have the strong gifts in the congregation, say, well, look, take all of this and tell us what to do with it, right? Give us a pathway. So that's one idea, a reimagination session around what has changed, what needs to change, where do we need to go? And if we didn't have any limitations, what would we do? Because those are things that always need to be on the table. Another tool, asset mapping. Some of you have probably already done this in your spaces and in your congregation, but this is another time when we go from a place and a time where folk have not been meeting in person, in the midst of something like this, we have to be able to see, okay, what do we have? Who's still here? Okay. First on the list is what? Pray and trust. Pray and trust. It's going to be redundant. What resources are all our resources, or what are all our resources? So when we talk about resources, if you see this second one, what are the gifts, the vocations, the passions, the skills, the knowledge, and the relational equity, meaning, you know, Dr. Bruce and I were talking earlier, and Dr. Bruce was saying, you know, everybody know Liz. Liz know everybody, right? It's that kind of thing, right? So if Liz is in your congregation, right, that's an asset, right? And so you're wanting to know who knows who and who knows what. And so you're starting to see that some of this isn't about moving full scale ahead with business as usual, sometimes this kind of stuff means taking a pause. It means, no, let's pause, let's regroup, let's figure out what's happening here. Let's discern together. Let's see who is in the space. Let's see who's committed in the space. Let's see what we're working with. Because guess what? What we're working with is who we are. That's who we are. Okay. So who's in the space? All right. Always go deep with those who are present. So before we start going too quickly to a place of how do we get back to people who are gone, we'll need to go there eventually, like, you know, at least touching people, like connecting with people. But sometimes we overlook those who have been and who are always there. How do we build a firm foundation with those who are there? Go deep with what you got. Okay? Go deep, because that firm foundation will matter as this change starts to happen. It's going to matter. Okay? So pour in. Consider what is the best method for connecting. When you start doing asset mapping, I've seen this done a number of ways, right? So the two ways I've seen it done the most is either through one-to-ones or through small groups, right? So like kind of focus groups. So what I've seen a lot of folk do is they will train leaders or people who volunteer around methods of listening, right? Basic pastoral care, methods of listening. They have core questions. They're checking in with folk, but they're wanting to see, where are people? What are you passionate about? What are you needing? What's happening in your life right now? And it's not an ask. So asset mapping is not an ask. We're not asking you to do anything or come to the table with anything. We just want to know where you are, who you are, how can we pray for you, and what are your passions and your gifts, right? And you're cataloging it. You're cataloging it. So some people have done one-to-ones. So let's say you have 5 people who are willing to do one-to-ones. If 5 people do 2 one-to-ones in a month, now you have, you know, touched 10 folk. Okay. So it's that kind of concept. Another way that I've seen this done is through small groups, similar to kind of like this reimagination session. You do a personal, you send out invites. Hey, I want to invite you. You know, 8 to 10 people. We're going to sit outside. We're going to set up coffee. We're going to have snacks. We're going to laugh. We're going to play. We might go to a park so kids can play, and we're going to talk. And you're asset mapping. You're hearing where people are. You're doing pastoral care. You're doing ministry, but you're also listening. Where are the passions? What do you need? What do you feel like you need spiritually right now? What do you feel like is your gift, right? Who is there? Pour into them. Okay. Then, of course, preaching and training. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments before we wrap up. But if people are volunteering to do this, like, teach people the skills of leadership ministry, right? Give people access so that it's not all just on you or on a handful of leaders to do all of this work. Other people are gifted and can do it, okay? If you only have 3 people, work with those 3 people, okay? That means you can't ask those 3 people to see 30 people in a month, right? It means just take it slow, but do the work and just do it well. Pray and trust God, okay? Last thing, y'all, another really hard one. Be willing to let go of what resources will not support. Say it again. Be willing to let go of what resources will not support. Let me give you an example so you don't have to be trying to guess what I'm talking about. One of my ministry places in the past, right? I came in, spiritual leader in the space, had a very small, limited budget. Fine, you know, it is what it is. But I had no support, right? So any support that I had to be garnered or kind of given or taken. I had no support, right? And so there was this long list of things that they wanted me to do. But the resources, which isn't just money, it's also people, right? It's time, it's gifts, right? did not support this long list. And so then I had to come in and I had to spend some time in the space, praying, meeting with people, getting to know people, because I was new in the space. You know, first 6 months to a year is getting to know people. And then I had to do my own assessment. What is really needed? How do my gifts fit here? What is God calling me to in this place? And I realized that what was needed most in this season, in this space, was pastoral care, which was a gift of mine, right? And so I knew then that I could do quality pastoral care. I couldn't do broad-based pastoral care. But since the budget didn't support programming anyway, right? And since I didn't have a lot of other people, I had to be very clear in being able to say to my people, y'all, I can do X, Y, and Z very well. I am not in the business of doing a lot of things kind of okay, but I am in the business of being very clear about what is needed and what is within my power and within my resources to do. And this is it. And so 60 to 70% of my work became what I saw over the time and the course of what I discerned as the core work, and my resources supported that. Okay. Now, if you all want me to do more, we'll need to talk about how to build resources for that. Another example, friend of mine who's a pastor, very simple. He said, you know, people said they wanted, you know, to do Sunday school, and he was following a paradigm that had Bible study and small groups, but he wasn't necessarily doing Sunday school. He said, we can do Sunday school. He says, but the people have to show up for Sunday school, and we have to be able to build a volunteer base for it. After 6 months to a year, that didn't happen, right? People wouldn't show up. Only 1 or 2 would show up here or there. He was like, no, we don't have the resources for this, and it's not something that people are committing to. So we don't need to keep pouring our energy into something that clearly is not what is needed right now. If you don't have the resources, consider it's okay. We can't do all things. We cannot do all things, right? Manageable commitment. So when it comes to volunteers, okay, there's another paradigm that I found to work. We pray and we trust, okay? And we offer, or I have in different ministry settings, but also I have a lot of pastors now that I'm working with who are starting to shift to this paradigm, offering smaller terms of commitment with opportunities to recommit, okay? So for example, rather than saying, you know, will you teach a class for in perpetuity? Will you just teach this class, right? It is, no, I want you to teach for a certain amount of time, right? We do this a lot with small groups. We cultivate small group leaders. We don't ask for more than a 3-month commitment. Will you be willing to lead for 3 months, reassess after 3 months, consider seeing if there's someone else who's in your group who would like to be trained, right? We need volunteers to reach out to people, right? Will you be willing to volunteer this month? Or would you be willing to volunteer 1 week a month, right? 2 hours. So people have a concept of how much commitment you're asking. Do you have to do this in every setting? No. But the way church has historically gone, people get burnt out. And we are living in a time where people are already burnt out. And it's hard to get volunteers because so few people volunteer that the few that come, they doing it all. All right. So consider having very clear terms of commitment, right? Can you give me this? I'm asking you to make it. And then we can talk about recommitment. All right. Multiple points of engagement and discipleship within existing modes of ministry, right? So you may find that, okay, folk might want to come back to church, but they don't want to do discipleship stuff, or they only want to do it over here, over there. Well, how do you begin to make sure that the discipleship, the deepening of their spirituality and their faith is showing up wherever it is that they show up? So we may not just be able to do discipleships just in small group, right? We might need to help our minister of music learn how to lead a 30-minute small group before choir practice, right? We might need to make sure that we are integrating the different ways of discipleship into the places where people show up, right? One, because people are already maxed out and they're tired, but two, it also helps to people to understand that all of what we do is about who we are becoming and how we love God and one another back. Okay, so we may not be able to do the same paradigms, but we have to meet people where they are. So if people are willing to commit over here, how do we find ways to make sure that we are also pouring into them spiritually and helping them to grow in discipleship wherever those modes are? Okay. Honor and appreciation for generosity. Many of us already do this. I'm putting this here because I'm not going to assume that all of us do. Okay. So when we start to talk about generosity, I know many pastors who actually preach on a rotation yearly that a part of being Christian in particular is to be generous. And generosity is not just about money, of course. It is time, talents, and treasure. Okay. The key here, though, is we don't get to determine what is generous for people, right? Which is why we do the invitation, we ask, we invite people to own the vision and the mission with us. We help people to understand that we're here to support you, but we're also here as a body to support one another. But we're also generous people. And so if it's just an hour you can give, then we accept your hour and we celebrate it. You know, if it's just $5 you can give, we accept your $5 and we celebrate it. Okay, so cultivate a culture of celebration. Now, here in parentheses, I put and lament, and that's just because I think many of our churches may do this, but I believe celebration and lament are two sides of the same coin. Okay, and that they can always coexist. And so I think, if anything, COVID is a reminder to us that we need communal spaces of lament, because when we are able to lament and free the pain and the hurt that's within us, then all of a sudden we have space for celebration. Okay. And for those of us who are coming out of a Black church tradition, this is a way of life for us, right? That, you know, what starts as a praise ends up as a cry, or what starts as a cry ends up as a praise, right? That they're back and forth. But particularly when we start to talk about volunteers, like how do we cultivate truly a way of celebrating? And this celebration doesn't necessarily mean that we have to hit the budget for it. This is another place of reimagination. So as people serve, as people love, how do we celebrate? Okay. So this is potentially one of my powerhouses. This has been a powerhouse for me. Masterminding and shared resources. So pray and trust together. So clergy and leader small groups, covenant small groups, okay? Everywhere I have traveled to serve across the nation and moved to serve, my mentor taught me to always cultivate a group of leaders who have shared experiences with you. So I always took the initiative to do that. And what it has done is it has created for me a nucleus and a safe haven, but what some people would now call think tanks, it becomes a place for masterminding. So masterminding is a coaching term, and it is a process of people sitting in a space, and we focus on one person, they bring an issue or something they want to talk about, and folk do, they ask them questions, they probe, they give them things, they're pouring into this one need together. Okay, so that's like a masterminding session. But small group leadership and clergy small groups, and this is across, of course, what I'm talking about here is across churches, right? So of the clergy in the community, of the leaders in the community, they don't all have to be clergy, but you're coming in covenant. Do you have to meet all the time? No. My current group meets twice a month, every other Friday. We texting all the time each other, but we meet twice a month, every other Friday at a set time, okay? We do masterminding sessions together. We are resources for one another, okay? And they act kind of as natural executive ministry teams for those of us who are pastors who don't have the budgeting or the staffing to have all these staff people, paid staff people, right? We are gleaning from, okay, help me think through this, right? What do I need to do, okay? But then we have shared resource models, okay? So a lot of the ways that I've seen these shared resource models work is either through focused ministry, right? So if 2 or 3 churches have a need and we're connected or we're aware of that need, how do we share our resources to get that need met, right? So let's say we all have a need to cultivate our college and young adult students, right? But none of us have enough monetary resources to hire someone even just part-time to do this work. Well, what about us pooling our resources together, hiring someone and following a paradigm that allows them to oversee the work of ministry, prepare and train people in our congregations together, and we enter into this partnership together, okay? I've seen it happen and work. Another way that I've seen this work is with mental health, for example. So a lot of our churches are realizing like our people need more mental health support, but how do we get them there? What do we do? Well, I've seen 2 paradigms that are shared that kind of work with this in terms of partnership. One is I've seen 3 churches here in Raleigh do just that. They took their budgeted money, right? Because they didn't have enough money to just go at it. They actually held on contract a clinician, paid her, she got her own insurance and everything. One church provided the space, and each church had so many slots, right? For mental health therapy that needed to happen that was beyond the scope of pastoral care, okay? So for example, each church could have up to 6 parishioners, families, and/or couples at a time. And when a slot came open, she would just contact that church, say you have a slot open and the next person on the list for that church can come. But the churches had pooled their resources to pay her. That's one paradigm. Another paradigm I saw was actually more of a partnership from within the community. And so another church that I work with, they have partnerships with therapists that they trust in the community, okay, who have given them a special rate, okay, and for their members, depending on what their budget looks like, and we can talk more about this, or I can answer questions about this. I know we don't have all the time in the world to do that now, but about the ways that you set this up so that it doesn't get out of hand. But they have a certain budgeted amount. They have clinicians that they partner with who give them a special rate, and members who need it are able to reach out to one pastor confidentially, get connected to one of these therapists, and the church will pay out of that budget up to so many sessions to get them started, okay? As a way of saying, if we can at least get you started, you can then work out, what is needed. So the first 3 or 4 sessions the church will cover at this special rate for one of these 3 therapists. And then if a person is in real crisis and cannot afford it, a lot of churches that I work with who do this will then say, well, if we have the budget and we can extend it, we will be in conversation with us. Let us also get you connected in terms of pastoral care, but let's see what other resources we might be able to connect you to. But a lot of times it's just getting people started. If people can get there, they can figure out a way to stay there, but it's getting people there. And so those are 2 examples. But if you are in a clergy group, your resources expand because those people are connected to, you are connected to. Okay, but you also don't feel like you're having to work through every dynamic that is happening in your space on your own. You're actually gleaning from the wisdom and the prayers and the support of other people, and you're literally using it like a clergy executive team. okay? But it's also a space for accountability, to remain true to God, yourself, and others. I cannot stress enough, you all, that it's not just about what we do, but it's about how we do it, okay? And though we have always been a people out of a tradition, out of the Black tradition in particular, that are reminded of the work of suffering and martyrdom, I just want to remind us that though we may at times be asked to be willing to be martyrs, nothing about our God says that that's God's goal for us, right? That the goal is not martyrdom. The goal is life, and life more abundant. And so all that we're doing, we are doing and we're modeling in a way that invites all of our people to a place of health and wholeness. And we cannot just say it. People will always do as we do and not as we say. So make sure that whatever you do, you are working within your resources, just because even your energy of your body and your physical resources set a standard. We reproduce the leaders that we are. Okay. So I'm gonna stop there because I feel like I talked for a long time. Let me unshare my screen. All right. And I will give it back over to my people.